A new report, Responsible AI in Consumer Enterprise, offers insight and guidance into the design of ethical artificial intelligence systems. I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Kathryn Hume. She is the Vice President of Product and Strategy for Integrate.ai. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thanks so much for having me, Tonya.
So welcome back to the ZDNet and Tech Republic show. Tell us again what Integrate.ai does.
Sure. So we work with large consumer enterprises, so the retail banks, insurance companies, media companies of the world. And we, as the name suggests, integrate artificial intelligence into their customer engagement operations. So things like which product should we sell next? Is somebody at risk of liability for churn? And we do this with a focus on trying to find the sweet spot between how much some constrained resource they might have. So maybe an offer or a discount, and then people who might be susceptible for that product.
Your company just released a report entitled Responsible AI in Consumer Enterprise. Before we get into the details, tell us about the goal and methodology behind the study.
Yeah, so primarily, there's a lot of talk these days around AI and society, ethics of AI. Is this good for us? Is it going to be automating jobs? Like thinking about data privacy in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And what we wanted to do is to go from the high level sort of philosophical discussions to really operationalizing the types of security, privacy, and ethics choices developers and interdisciplinary teams, so data scientists, technologists, business analysts, designers, and then even executives, the types of questions they need to be asking at each point in the machine learning system development process so that they can actually go from, I don't know, is this okay? Or is our business at risk? To let's turn this into a set of small questions that we can actually act on and resolve.
Tell us about the responsible AI principles that are detailed in the report.
Yeah, so a lot of principles, if you were going to look at ethical AI principles, they tend to be pretty general. So things like be socially sensitive, be fair. And we wanted to go a step deeper and change it from these sort of imperatives, do X, do Y, to something that gives people intuitions on the things that matter. So for example, our first principle is when you are designing a machine learning system, know that the default assumption is that the future is going to be like the past. So for example, when you're building out a model, you're going to find patterns in data, and they're going to be patterns that are related to how a customer population has behaved in the past. And it may be that in the past, you've done a great job serving, just to make the example really clear, like rich white males, and you've done a horrible job serving African-American older females. And so if you just go and build out a model, a machine learning system, an AI system using the standard practices, you're going to replicate what you've done in the past and continue to treat that subpopulation unfairly. So our principle will say, if you're actually concerned about bias or concerned about being fair with people, you might have to design a system that's oriented towards the future, not towards the past. And that's different from standard practice. So that's one example. We have another principle in there that talks about just the basic assumption that anytime you work with a statistical aggregate, so sort of the insights that you get on people, and you're building out a system, you're in consumer enterprise. So this is about data, people's behavior in the world, what they do. You're taking like all the richness of the world, so an individual in his or her glory, and you're representing it as an abstraction. And the minute you do that, all sorts of ethical questions arrive. And basically that's kind of at the essence of AI in the enterprise. So those are two of them. And there's multiple others in there that we're trying to trying to give people grounded intuitions on what matters.
What recommendations do you have for companies looking to embark on their own first AI project?
Yeah, great question. So in the executive summary of the report, we start off by saying somebody is going to have to be the arbiter between innovation and opportunity and then risk. And right now we're at the phase with regards to sort of risk management and governance of AI systems where we're starting to get a set of codified tools that you can go out and purchase and sort of plug in. But a lot of it is still at the point in development and its early maturity where there's judgment calls to be made. And so I think one of the principles that occurs in the paper and recommendations that I would extend is that you have to take a risk-based approach. You have to go through and you have to say, okay, what are the things in our business, the values that we have that absolutely can't be broken? no matter what happens, they're in there as a constraint. And one of the things where we're okay if we make a couple of mistakes, and we've accepted that as acceptable risk for our business. And basically, most of the time, it's the executives that have to make that call. So management needs to be involved in these discussions and not just sort of push off AI to the analytics group that are sort of off working in the corner of the business and then expecting that magical results come from that. So I think the moral of the story is that there needs to be interdisciplinary discussions between the technical side, the business side, the design side, and even customers to try to get to the root of what some of these risks are. And then the second thing that I would say is it's helpful to always start with your business problem, what your business wants to achieve. I see a lot of companies that they have the AI bug. They're just like totally interested. They feel like they need to do this or else they're going to fall behind. And there's a lot of just mission critical business problems that may or may not necessarily require AI, and that's okay. And then there's other ones where it could be an amazing opportunity. So really getting a good intuition, having everybody have a good intuition, not on how the algorithms work and how the math works, but just what they can and can't do and where the risks may or may not lie, so that there can be a grounded discussion on what's valuable for the business.
I want to drill down a little bit on the machine learning. Describe the responsible AI framework and tell us about the machine learning system development process.
Yeah, for sure. So I've found in my experience working with, be it large Fortune 500 enterprises or small startups, that while there's going to be differences in how you go about building a product, there's more or less, everybody follows more or less the same process. So you have to start out by asking, what problem are we solving? What are we trying to do here? And how does our business process work today? And where do we imagine that we could sort of inject in some insight from data that could enable things to work differently in the future, oriented towards some business goal? And then, you go through and you say, okay, we have to collect data. Where does that come from? Is it going to be just our first party data, or is it going to also come from third parties? And if you think about sort of some of the ethical risks, it's already difficult to know exactly where data is coming from in a first party company environment, and it becomes really tricky to keep track of things when you shift out into a third party, because you don't know exactly how they've collected it. Is it coming from open source? Do they have rigorous processes around whether they can or cannot use that data, et cetera? It's often, and in the ways of the future are going to be where, there is data sharing across various communities. And so, I think we're developing tools to grapple with that. Integrate.ai is actually one of the premises of our company, is the ability to enable two different private companies to exchange data to boost the performance of the machine learning models while protecting their privacy. So, we're working on this, but not all vendors take the same ethical approach that we do. And so it can be difficult to track that. So you've got your data, and then, you build out a model. So you do some math on it, and the math will have some results. And then most of the time when we talk about machine learning, this discourse sort of stops there. We have to then do something with this model, right? So it leads to an action. Do you offer somebody a product? Do you not offer them a product? Do you say X or do you say Y? You get an outcome on that, and you retrain the model. So there's so many stages and levels of complexity in going from an idea to sort of a functioning system over time. And, in the framework, we break down each of those various subsections and then nail in, all right, when you're considering security in the stage of actually building out a model, what could go wrong? Why is it different than the security practices companies might be used to?
So to segue off of that, then, what are some of the questions that must be asked to operationalize the ethics in AI? Who should you ask and when?
Ooh, great question. So one of the ethical questions we consider, for example, once you've built out a model, you've put it into production, and it's working, it's out in the world. So one of the ethical questions we consider is, say today is July 19th, 2018. Say you're a bank and you've been using machine learning to decide whether or not I get a loan. And on July 19th, based on the data that's fed into the system and the profile that it's made of me vis-a-vis other customers, it says, nope, it's denied. And then the model is just going to change because it's going to get new data over time. And maybe, a year later, I come back and this time it says yes. And so one of the ethical questions is, if I later on in the future want to look back and say, well, why didn't you offer me a loan? Why did you deny me a loan a year ago? we think through, okay, well, if you're going to productionalize a system, you need to ensure that you have these auditing controls and logging controls so you can reconstruct the decision that was made in the past sometime in the future. And then you say, okay, well, who needs to be involved in that? Well, that's going to be a discussion potentially with the legal and compliance team, because under the new European General Data Protection Regulations, that kind of right is now allotted to consumers. So you have to be prepared for the type of rights that a consumer might have. You have to have your design team, because you have to say, gosh, if somebody were to receive a no answer, how do we communicate that in a way that doesn't alienate our customer base? And then you have to have obviously the technical and operations team that are going to design, the auditing controls and put in the bells and whistles into the actual system to ensure that it's logging and auditing things. So there's lots of people involved in that.
So, to dig deeper into GDPR, I mean, privacy and security continue to be at top of mind. How do privacy and security factor into responsible AI design?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I view privacy and security as an extension almost of responsible and ethical AI. So fundamentally, it comes down to the questions related to the use of people's data. And this is, again, responsible AI and consumer enterprise. So the report doesn't touch upon autonomous weapons and, like, let's say the use of IoT data in pure industrial context, et cetera. It's really about people's data and their behavior and the types of things that companies feel like they can and can't do. And so privacy is front and center there. And what's interesting is that it actually poses some really thorny questions related to some of the trade-offs companies might have to think about related to privacy versus fairness. So as an example, the sort of maxims of privacy today are that it's related to an individual's right to privacy. So, I and you, we both get to come in and say, all right, you company are allowed to use my data for this minimum purpose and this use. And the assumption then is if it's used in sort of ways that have not been explicitly contracted between the two of us, then something's gone a little awry. And if you and I have different preferences related to our data use, so for me, minimum is like very small, and for you, it might be larger. If we were to give people different rights as opposed to have something standardized, then down the line, the company might be able to make a great machine learning model to represent my preferences and a poor one for you, or vice versa. I can't remember who had more or less. But basically, the moral of the story is the amount of data, machine learning models perform best when they've got a lot of data about different individuals, and you come into some gaps if different subpopulations are represented less well. But on the privacy side, if it's really oriented just towards individuals, then and our choices on how much data could be used, then that's going to potentially lead to disparate impact down the line. So it's almost like we have to think more and extend our thinking beyond just, all right, the individual, but like overall communities when you're trying to build out statistically oriented models that could give insights about people.
Okay, then how do you measure or quantify if you've met the requirements of responsible AI? I mean, how do you know when you've arrived?
That's a great question. And I think is there a general standard to evaluate if a company's been fair? Are all companies fair in the same way? We're not there yet. And even in the machine learning community, there's still a lot of debate regarding what the definition of fairness should look like when it gets represented as a statistical problem. So there's still some work to do there. However, I think it is possible to have, at some level in the company, to have a statement that's made and a policy related to fairness. There might be something like, when we are allocating loans to a population, we want it almost like affirmative action type stuff. Like we want a certain percentage to be going to some sub-minority population, and that can be measured. You just count. once those loans are allocated, it's like, what do the outcomes look like? So that's a way of flipping. There's a lot of dialogue around explainable AI and the fact that these are black boxes and we're not really sure how they're working. You can sort of flip it on its head and say, as opposed to focusing on why the output was there, how about we just focus on the outcomes and that we're looking for, and govern to make sure that if we're not achieving equal treatment, based upon some policy that the company has set, then we can sort of tune it and try to revisit that and do something differently. So to sum that up, that means, someone's got to say, this is what we're trying to achieve here. And companies are used to doing that. They certainly set metric goals around revenue, right? They've got their KPIs on how much they want something to increase. And so, so they know how to do that. They just have to think about if they want to have values incorporated into their metrics as well.
Well, Kathryn Hume, it's always great to have your insights on ethics and machine learning and artificial intelligence. If somebody wants to connect with you or maybe get a copy of your recent report, how can they do that?
Sure, so multiple ways. So I'm on LinkedIn, Kathryn Hume, and then on Twitter at @HumeKathryn. And then the report is available on the Integrate AI website, and we now have a subpage called Ethics of Artificial Intelligence where you can find it. And then also from the main, if you go to just www.integrate.ai, there's some subpages to click on, and there's one called Trust. And so that is the subpage to look into that will have all of the ethics resources.
Thank you again. And if you guys want to connect with me or find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or maybe find me on social media by going to tonyahall.net. I've got links to all my social channels. I hope to hear from you. Thanks for watching.